Hello, I want to talk to you about the neurotransmitter theory of addiction. I'm going to walk you through some slides. So let me share my screen. Don't judge me for my desktop. It's awful, I know. Okay. So first, what is addiction? Addiction is defined as compulsive seeking, obtaining substance behavior that is out of control. And research has indicated that neurotransmitters indicate which drug an individual is susceptible to develop an addiction to. The three main neurotransmitters involved in this are dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, or also known as norepinephrine. The UK uses adrenaline and the US uses epinephrine, but I pull research across professions worldwide. So sometimes you'll see these terms interchangeably used. And that's because I'm literally writing down from what I pulled from that study. The timing of effects equates to the degree of addiction potential, meaning the younger you are when you have exposure to certain drugs and the susceptibility to those drugs increases the likelihood of addiction potential. It triggers the release of dopamine in different ways, and it's been shown to increase activation in the VTA or ventral tegmental area, increased activation in the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in your reward processing, and increased activation in the dorsal striatum, included in the basal ganglia, involved in operant conditioning. If you're not familiar with that term, basic psychology, classical conditioning was Pavlov pairing the bell sound to the dogs being presented with food, and they would begin to salivate. And because the novel stimulus is paired with a natural stimulus, you can essentially create an association, a neurological and biological reaction association to the novel stimulus that you naturally had with the original stimulus, right? That's classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is where we develop a specific response to something because of our experience. If you have ever had food poisoning and you don't eat that food anymore, that is operant conditioning, okay? Negative reinforcement is also often what is leading to what we call self-medication. When we talk about an individual is self-medicating when they are using substances to manage their mood and physiological state. Tolerance is important when thinking about addiction. So this is called the A-B process. The A process is when a substance is introduced into the body and it creates a change in the physiological state. B is the compensatory response that the central nervous system, or your brain, kicks in order to compensate, to counteract that initial stimulating event. And what happens is your brain will also store contextual cues. So say, for example, an individual who uses heroin, does it in their apartment bathroom, every Friday. Every time they go into their apartment bathroom, the brain is going to prime thinking, this is when we normally would use, so we need to start to initiate this counteractive process to suppress some of the effects of the substance that's creating physiological changes. This is how an individual can be using the same dosage of a drug regularly and then do it in a different location and still overdose. It's because the brain, through tolerance, has picked up on contextual cues so that it can start that counteractive process before the stimulation or the drug has entered the system. And two, where the counteractive process, the B process, has built up such a strong counteractive effect to the initial drug effects on the body that they don't have the same reaction. That's how you have to take more and more and more to have the same kind of effect, because your body gets used to fighting off the effects of the drug. So you don't experience the same kind of high. All right, so causes of addiction. First, it's a medical disease. It's a combination of genetics, environment, and stress. Serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine exist in balance naturally for all of us, but we're all born with a genetic tendency towards a slight imbalance. The more off balance we are, the greater the risk for addiction is. The neurotransmitter that's most out of balance also predicts the likely addiction, but stress is a key trigger because stress throws off the brain's homeostasis and natural balance of those neurotransmitters. So we all are born with genes that regulate our neurotransmitters, but each gene has natural variants. And they all have varying numbers of variants. Like BDNF has like 11. I think serotonin has, let's see, 3 or 4 natural variants of some of the genes that regulate serotonin. And those variants occur widely and throughout the population, meaning if 10 of us are in the classroom, there's a good chance that 3 or 4 of you would have the same variant of a serotonin transporter gene that I have, right? But each of those variants regulates those neurotransmitters slightly differently. So for example, the one gene that has been studied a lot in relation to addiction and mental health issues and behavioral issues is the SCL6A4 gene. They are all license plate names, so it doesn't get any easier. But it's also been called the HTTP gene, HTTP-LR, the SERT gene, tons of aliases because apparently they also can't keep the same name, so they keep changing them. But the SCL6A4 gene is involved in serotonin transport. And there are different variants. Some individuals have a short-long variant, some individuals have a short-short variant, and some individuals have a long-long variant. Those who have the short variant are very sensitive to their environment. Good things feel amazing, but bad things are the end of the world. And what they found is that because the short allele is overactive in transport for serotonin, it means that the serotonin isn't left in the synaptic gap, the synaptic cleft, for it to be collected by neural receptors to actually have the chemical reaction, right? So just having free floating serotonin in your system doesn't do any good if it doesn't actually bind to a receptor. And individuals with the short allele tend to not have as much serotonin left in place for it to bind to a receptor. So they tend to have what we would perceive as lower reactions to serotonin. So they don't experience the same level of benefits of feeling calm, feeling content, things like that. These individuals are highly susceptible to becoming traumatized, developing anxiety disorders, developing depression disorders, to developing other types of mental health issues in relation to stress and adversity. And in terms of addiction, and we'll talk about this a little bit here in a minute, they're also highly sensitive to alcohol and opiates. And you could be somewhere on the spectrum, right, for your neurotransmitter regulation. And let's say you've got a little bit less serotonin, than your best friend does, but not so much that it creates mental health difficulties for you. But then you experience a really intense adverse event. and it wears you down, right? It creates a dysregulation even further, so that serotonin is likely going to drop a little bit further. And then you are at greater risk of developing an addiction. So how does that happen? Well, essentially, these three neurotransmitters have drugs that bind to their receptors. So alcohol and opiates actually bind to serotonin receptors and make the brain believe that you have more serotonin, which is why when they take those substances, they actually feel relief. They feel, that's why we call it self-medicating. They feel, I guess, a lessening of the distress they were experiencing from having lower levels of it, on top of the fact that the brain says, oh my gosh, we're finally functioning like we're supposed to. So it triggers the reward pathway to increase the likelihood that you are going to crave, think about, want, and pursue that substance again, because your brain says we need that because that makes us function like we're supposed to. And the other two neurotransmitters also are involved, and we'll go over each one and the drugs that they're associated with. But this is how this sort of creates this pattern. So you'll often find individuals with these genetic vulnerabilities because of an imbalance of neurotransmitters with a strong family history of either addiction or the mental health associated with those neurotransmitters. Okay. So for example, for serotonin, you would see a family history of depression or anxiety issues, or alcohol or opiates. For dopamine, you would see a family history of either ADHD or bipolar disorder, could also even be some schizophrenia type issues, because that's a dysregulation of dopamine as well. Or you would see a family history of stimulant abuse, right? Cocaine, methamphetamine, things like that. And then for norepinephrine, what the brain is actually trying to do is counter the effects of norepinephrine. There's an overabundance of it. And so for these individuals, you would see a family history of things like marijuana, Xanax, things that are definitely going to calm you down and ease you out, right? Or you would see a family history of anxiety, panic disorders, just being really keyed up pretty consistently, right? Okay, let me move on. I digress, and I'm sure I'm going to run into slides where I just spoke way ahead of where I'm actually at right now. Okay, so dopamine and the reward center. And if you don't mind, just appreciate the visual that I embedded in the slide here, because I really love this stuff. So addictive substances studied cause changes in dopamine. The more pleasure an experience gives, or more an experience is repeated, the stronger the reward highway becomes. The reward highway is a neural pathway. The stronger that reward neural pathway is, the more the brain wants to repeat the experience. And this is what drives the thoughts, the cravings, when we talk about in substance treatment, how we really don't want individuals to start to talk about what it was like when they were using, because you'll get this sort of almost love affair dialogue start to come out, and you can see the emotions that are connected to that. That is their brain trying to reinforce that we need to do that again, because the brain is actually experiencing the drug in a very different way. Interestingly enough, the most addictive drugs are actually plant-based. The chemicals the plant produces closely mimic dopamine, so the brain thinks it's receiving the equivalent of excessive dopamine. But this happens for dopamine and serotonin as well. I found my cursor. All right, so dopamine and addiction. Excessive dopamine transporters in children result in low levels of dopamine. Think of this as your ADHD. In adults or older adolescents with excess dopamine, these are going to be those who struggle with mania, bipolar disorders, as well as schizophrenia. They are most likely to become addicted to stimulants that mimic dopamine. Now, this is the kicker. With dopamine, it doesn't matter if you have too little or too much. Any imbalance, you are at increased likelihood of developing an addiction to it, because your brain is high on dopamine already. If you have too much, and if you don't have enough, it craves it, it needs it really bad, okay? Cocaine is one of the most notorious drugs, but methamphetamine as well, are drugs that are highly addictive to individuals with a dysregulation of dopamine. It doesn't matter if it's too little or too much. Cocaine in particular blocks reuptake of dopamine. It accumulates in the synapse to stimulate receptors further, which causes the person to feel extremely good, like dopamine times 1,000. It wears off. The brain's used to having that quantity of dopamine, because remember, the brain thinks that the cocaine, because it's triggering the receptors, that it is dopamine. So the brain thinks, I'm used to having that much, so it triggers the need and the desire for more. Over time, more and more is needed to produce the same effect. The person begins to use cocaine merely to function. Other drugs that may mimic dopamine include methamphetamine, dexedrine, Ritalin, and Adderall. Less harmful stimulants, I'm totally going to ruin your day here, include caffeine and sugar. If it makes you feel any better, I'm totally bummed about that too. So what about treatment? Treatment of dopamine-related addictions. So less harmful drugs that mimic dopamine are used to ease withdrawal when we're looking at abstinence treatment. Safer dopamine-mimicking drugs for short-term use during detox are also used. I've listed them there. Neurontin, Klonopin, Xanax, Valium, Seroquel, Zyprexa, and Depakote. You're going to see Seroquel pop up a lot. Somebody's marketed it really well. Drugs suitable for long-term stabilization for ADHD are Adderall, Ritalin, Wellbutrin, Dexedrine, Strattera, Concerta, and Provigil. Drugs for long-term stabilization of bipolar disorder are Zyprexa, Seroquel, Abilify, and Lamictal. Some of these drugs are addictive themselves, but without the severe side effects of cocaine, meth, or other harmful drugs. So here's the kicker. If a person has what you suspect is a genetic sensitivity, this dysregulation of neurotransmitters, because that's driven by a genetic sensitivity to a substance, because you've taken their family history, not just of substance use, but you're also looking for these mental health cues, parents, siblings, grandparents, okay? Then you need to figure out what they need long-term, okay? Is it possible that they have ADHD? Is it possible that they have bipolar disorder? Is it possible that they have schizophrenia or something of a schizophrenia type disorder, like some of the personality disorders also have dysregulation in dopamine? Because if we don't treat the long-term consequence of a dysregulation of the neurotransmitter, then relapse is likely. In fact, I wouldn't even just say likely, I would say probable. If we don't address what is being removed by taking away the drug, the brain is going to continue to fight them in order to try to find something to replace that with, or to get more of it. It will be a lifelong struggle. Not to mention the fact that you can suffer mental health consequences from the dysregulation of the neurotransmitters once you come off the substance, right? And we're going to talk about that here in a minute when we get to serotonin. So serotonin is involved in moods and emotions. It's most commonly known for being related to depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive behaviors. And those individuals who have lower levels of serotonin functioning, lower neurotransmitter activation for serotonin, tend to be very susceptible to developing addictions to alcohol and opiates like heroin, OxyContin, because these mimic serotonin, which leads to a temporary increase in serotonin levels, the mock serotonin levels. So the person feels better, significantly better. And that's likely why, especially during, we talk about dystopian times in society, why we're having, an opioid epidemic, not just because of overprescribing. Only about 10% of people who try substances actually develop addictions. So the issue is the combination of the biological vulnerability in conjunction with exposure to the substance and the degree to which that biological vulnerability is affected by it. This is why also you will see varying levels and severity of addiction, not just addict or not, right? You can have a person who is psychologically, emotionally, and somewhat physically addicted to a substance, but they may not show the same level of physical dependence as somebody else, right? Okay, so treatment for serotonin-related addictions. First, treatment for opiates is more complex. Short-term opiate withdrawal is usually buprenorphine. Anxiety, they'll treat like the symptoms, anxiety and sleep. So for anxiety, they might use Klonopin, Ativan, Xanax, Neurontin, or Seroquel. For short-term, for sleep, they might use Ambien, Luesta, Sonata, Vistaril, and Benadryl. For alcohol withdrawal, we're looking at Neurontin, Lyrica, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, and Librium would help at first. Long-term stabilizing would include SNRIs or SSRIs, and some of the SNRIs include Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Celexa, and Paxil, and long-term SSRIs can include Pristiq, Savella, Effexor, and Cymbalta. These drugs will block the reuptake of serotonin so that it stays in the synaptic cleft longer, so that it can be collected by serotonin receptors and generate that neurotransmitter effect. Important to note when thinking about addiction treatment, it breaks down into two categories, right? We have abstinence focused, we have harm reduction focused. Neither of them really look at long-term treatment. So, well, harm reduction, just letting you continue with the drug, but even with medication-assisted treatment, it's literally replacing another addictive substance that's legalized and monetized with one that's illegal, supposedly with less harmful effects. But I'll keep my opinion to myself. But thinking about abstinence and someone trying to achieve sobriety, we rarely get past really that 28-day cycle. We get them to sobriety, and then it's a matter of, okay, white knuckle it, social support, and you just got to keep moving forward. Rarely will you see providers who will advocate for long-term treatment. And here's the issue. One of the most common experiences of individuals when they achieve sobriety from alcohol and opiates are chronic, either long-term or repeated periods of depression, as well as intense episodes of anxiety. Why is that? Because their serotonin is all screwed up. And we need to start thinking as practitioners about, look, we're not prescribers, but if you're helping a client and you're working in substance treatment, then the least you can do is psychoeducation, where you say, okay, now that you've achieved sobriety, here's something you need to be mindful of. Long term, there's a chance that you could experience depression or anxiety, okay? And I don't want you to just think that you can mind over matter it and white knuckle your way through it, because that actually increases the risk of them, backtracking and relapsing back into use. Tell them, SSRIs and SNRIs will help with this. It is common for this to be needed. This is not, just solely poor choices. This is a biological vulnerability in you. It's like, if you had too little fat cells, or if you don't make enough insulin, and so you don't process sugar properly. We recognize medication for those types of issues, but we don't recognize medication for a recognized medical disease of addiction other than sobriety. Like detox, we recognize it. But it's rare to see someone really advocate and say, you might need some long-term assistance with this, and that's okay. Okay. And this isn't even talking about damage to the brain from the drug use. This is just acting as if we're picking up right before you started using and what you needed then, right? So it's important that we're mindful of this. All right, norepinephrine. Norepinephrine signals the fight or flight or freeze response. Remember, norepinephrine synonymous with noradrenaline. If you have an overabundance of norepinephrine, this leads to intense anxiety, which can lead to panic and panic disorders. It also plays a role in sleep disorders. So does serotonin, because they both are involved in regulating your sleep-wake cycle. So norepinephrine and addiction. The drugs that seem to be the ones that are the most sensitive for these individuals are Valium, Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, marijuana, or nicotine. Endorphins also quiet the need for soothing from anxiety, but it can actually lead to becoming addicted to physical exercise, since the brain receives an endorphin rush. Now, this one's interesting because they don't bind necessarily to norepinephrine sites, not 100% of them, but they suppress norepinephrine activity, and by doing so create a state of calm and peace in an individual. And if you are a person who is not experiencing a lot of that, that can be something that you need, because I'll be honest, I feel like anxiety is underplayed like crazy, and it is awful. People say, oh, anxiety. We should really call it the constant fear disorder, because anxiety is fear. And living in fear for long periods of time is not only bad for your brain, but it's just awful. It's absolutely awful to never be able to have any peace. Anyway. I digress. So with norepinephrine and addiction, the biggest thing is trying to regulate the effects of norepinephrine. And individuals, when they come off of these drugs, can develop some nasty anxiety, sort of like kickbacks, where it intensifies because it was suppressed for so long and now it's kind of out of whack. But then even once that settles down through the initial detox, long-term, they're going to have issues. And if we don't treat it with something long-term, like an SSRI or an SNRI, then we're not really addressing the issue, and they are more likely to relapse. Did I speak ahead of a slide? I did a little bit. Sorry about that. So short-term detox is Valium, Xanax, Ativan, and Klonopin, or phenobarbital. The amount of the addicted substances can be decreased over time. I say that because every one of the detox substances is addictive. Long-term treatment includes the SNRIs or SSRIs, even beta blockers like propranolol, Lyrica, Neurontin, and Seroquel can help with long-term treatment of reducing excess amounts of norepinephrine. Okay, a note about genetics. You are born with an imbalance in one of these three neurotransmitters. We all are. Genes have been linked to certain addictions. And I've listed them here. And again, like I said, they're all like license plates. Okay. The ADHD gene is involved with alcohol, drugs. This one is narcotic drugs. NACHR is just general addiction. GABA is narcotic drugs. GABA2 is alcohol. ANKK1 is comorbid alcohol and other types of drugs. Children of alcoholics have a 4-fold increase in the likelihood of becoming alcoholics themselves compared to children born non-alcoholics, and vulnerability to initiation, continued use, and propensity to become dependent. And the risk for these individuals is moderate to high. The typical evaluation of a person who is suspected of substance abuse or addiction is to get their history about when they began, what drugs that they've taken, what do they take now, how often, how much, and the mode of consumption of these drugs. And then they might ask a little bit about family history of drug use. You rarely see them actually inquire about the mental health status associated with the neurotransmitters linked to these addictions, specific addictions. Why? Because this information isn't prevalent. And the reason it's not prevalent, I'm going to stop sharing for a second because that's my last slide, right? Yeah. The reason that this isn't prevalent is because professions are siloed, okay? You've got social sciences over here, and in social sciences, you've got psychology, you've got social work, you've got counseling programs in schools, social sciences. And then you've got biological sciences. So you've got like neuroscience, you've got medical general science, you've got disease-oriented science, you've got genetic science, okay? This information came from the neuroscience research profession, okay? And it's not even rooted in the US. It's rooted over, I think I pulled it from somebody who published in the UK, but don't quote me on that. You look up Klepper, you can find it. When research is conducted and we identify relationships and we formulate theories, scientists like myself publish them, and we try to disseminate them at conferences and so forth, but rarely do scientists go out into the practice community and say, let me teach you about what I've learned, because our job is science, right? And so we have limited amount of time and specific expectations of how many publications we have to do, how many grants we have to get, and teaching expectations and so forth. And so the job makes it really difficult to do anything other than publish and go to some conferences. And the conferences that we typically go to is where all of the other researchers are. So unless you're a researcher who also teaches practice courses, this stuff doesn't usually make it into the practice arena for about 10 years, because that's how long it takes for enough knowledge to build up to create a whole new textbook worth of stuff for them to go, okay, now we have all this evidence. And then the reliance is on researchers and academics like myself and editors to make sure that they've gotten all of that information. And are they bridging the other professions, right? Because if you just search addiction literature and you don't include terminology specifically looking at neuroscience, neurobiology, central nervous system effects, then this research isn't going to come up. So there's this big gap in trying to bridge across professions in order to really create this sort of webbing of knowledge, okay? The only reason that I know this is because I'm an interdisciplinary researcher and I have trained interdisciplinary, right? But you don't typically find this. So don't freak out, don't panic. It's okay and it's good. This is my way of trying to get this into the practice field. Okay, I hope I answered your questions. Sorry, my ADHD is off the hook right now, so I was a bit all over the place. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thanks for listening.